Let me show you something Washington may have underestimated. A few months ago, Donald Trump stood before the cameras with his trademark confidence and made a statement that immediately captured global attention. He suggested that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. It wasn't presented as a joke. It wasn't political sarcasm. It wasn't an offhand remark. It was a serious political statement. Then he followed it with another claim. We don't need anything Canada has. Think about those words for a moment. We don't need anything Canada has. Those weren't the words of an ordinary politician. They came from the leader of the world's largest economy, commander of its most powerful military, and one of the most influential political figures on the global stage. Yet they were directed at America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, and a country connected to the United States by nearly 9,000 kilometers of shared border. Many believed the pressure would work. The assumption seemed simple. Canada was the smaller economy. The United States held overwhelming political and economic influence, and sooner or later, Ottawa would have no choice but to compromise. Would Prime Minister Mark Carney travel to Washington prepared to negotiate from a position of weakness? Would Canada conclude that resisting the United States simply wasn't worth the cost? That was certainly the expectation in many political circles. But that's not what happened. I'm Daniel Chen, Senior Geopolitical Analyst. For years, I've studied how power really moves through international politics, not the version performed in front of television cameras, but the one hidden inside supply chains, energy networks, trade flows, financial markets, and the quiet decisions made long before world leaders step in front of a microphone. What you're about to see isn't a story about one country defeating another. It's a case study in how leverage really works, because the confrontation between Trump and Canada was never just about tariffs. It wasn't simply about diplomacy. At its core, it was about economic dependence, strategic leverage, and a North American supply chain that had taken decades to build. And as the confrontation unfolded, the assumptions that shaped it began colliding with economic reality. To understand why, we have to go back to where the confrontation began. From the very beginning, the Trump administration's approach toward Canada relied heavily on political pressure. The pattern was familiar. Identify a target, increase the pressure, assume the other side will eventually compromise because the United States is larger, louder, and economically stronger, then declare victory. The weakness in that strategy wasn't the pressure itself. It was the assumption that the other side had no meaningful alternatives. In Canada's case, that assumption would soon be tested. Whether Washington failed to recognize that reality or simply chose to ignore it, the pressure continued to build. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer publicly grouped Canada alongside China while discussing retaliatory trade measures. Pause for a moment and think about that. Canada, America's largest trading partner, was being mentioned in the same conversation as China. Yet this is the very country that supplies virtually all of America's imported natural gas. Let that number sink in for a moment. Roughly 99%. We'll come back to why that figure matters later. Around the same time, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick publicly criticized Canada's decision to remove American wines from retail shelves, calling it an insult to America. That single phrase captured the mood surrounding the dispute. Instead of focusing on the realities of deeply integrated North American supply chains built over decades, much of the public conversation became centered on symbolism, political messaging, and national pride. Economic interdependence was increasingly overshadowed by political confrontation. And this is where I'd like to make something clear. My argument isn't that Donald Trump lacked intelligence. It's something more nuanced than that. Leaders often make decisions based on the advice they receive. And over time, it's possible for any administration to become surrounded by voices that reinforce its existing assumptions. Trump built his career in environments where pressure often produced results. And that approach appeared to shape much of his negotiating style. But Canada proved to be a very different kind of opponent. Instead of responding with public confrontation or immediate concessions, Ottawa chose a quieter strategy. While Washington focused on projecting strength, Canada was steadily building leverage. It wasn't happening through dramatic speeches, headline-grabbing announcements, or viral social media campaigns. It was unfolding patiently, methodically, and largely outside the spotlight. The first real signal didn't come from Parliament or a government ministry. It came from ordinary Canadians. In grocery stores across Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and communities throughout the country, consumers began making individual purchasing decisions that collectively became impossible to ignore. Without a nationwide government directive or coordinated campaign, many Canadians simply chose to stop buying American products. The movement wasn't imposed from the top down. It spread organically, driven by individual choices that gradually turned into a broader national trend. The Buy Canadian movement gained momentum. Facebook communities supporting Canadian-made products grew to more than 1.4 million members, while mobile apps that allowed shoppers to identify American products by scanning barcodes surged in popularity. Consumers increasingly turned away from American wine, spirits, and a wide range of U.S. brands, transforming thousands of everyday shopping decisions into one of the defining economic stories of the dispute. Then the numbers began telling a very different story. American wine exports to Canada didn't just decline, they collapsed. Shipments fell by 78%, with export values dropping from approximately $460 million to just $103 million. That represents a loss of roughly $357 million in a single export market, driven largely by changing consumer behavior rather than direct government restrictions. The global impact was even more remarkable. Canada alone accounted for 81% of the worldwide decline in American wine exports. Think about that for a moment. More than 4 out of every $5 the United States lost in global wine exports came from a single country whose consumers increasingly chose to buy something else. And the effects extended far beyond the wine industry. American liquor exports to Canada fell by 85% during the second quarter of 2025, leaving the remaining trade worth less than $10 million. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, reported a 62% decline in Canadian sales, while Kentucky whiskey exports to Canada dropped by half, reaching their lowest level in a decade. Then came an announcement that suggested these changes might be more than a temporary disruption. Jim Beam confirmed that production at its distillery in Claremont, Kentucky, would be suspended throughout 2026. Whether driven entirely by Canadian demand or by a combination of market factors, the announcement highlighted the broader pressures facing the industry. Behind every percentage point were real businesses, workers, and local communities beginning to feel the economic impact. Those concerns eventually reached Capitol Hill, where lawmakers representing wine-producing regions and bourbon-producing states started asking difficult questions about the long-term consequences of the administration's trade strategy. Meanwhile, public opinion inside Canada remained remarkably consistent. Polling indicated that 73% of Canadians supported continuing the boycott, while only 20% favored bringing American products back immediately. This wasn't a government directive that could simply be reversed overnight. It reflected a broader shift in public sentiment, and history has shown that once consumer behavior becomes deeply rooted, changing it can be far more difficult than policymakers expect. Before long, Washington itself began feeling the political pressure. Industry lobbyists intensified their outreach to congressional offices, and senators from states with significant wine and bourbon industries increasingly questioned whether the strategy was delivering its intended results. Quietly, a more uncomfortable question began circulating through the halls of power. Were these policies strengthening America's negotiating position, or were they beginning to impose greater costs at home than abroad? But as significant as the consumer boycott became, it was never the true center of gravity in this confrontation. The real story was energy. And that's the part of this conflict that deserves far more attention, because it helps explain why Washington's approach gradually began to change. The numbers are difficult to ignore. The United States receives roughly 99% of its imported natural gas from Canada. Around 85% of its imported electricity also comes from north of the border, while nearly 60% of America's imported crude oil originates in Canada. Those aren't ordinary trade relationships. They represent structural dependencies built into the North American economy over decades. Along the Gulf Coast, many American refineries were specifically designed to process heavy crude from Alberta's oil sands. They cannot simply switch to a different type of oil without significant technical modifications and substantial financial costs. For years, those refiners also benefited from an advantage that rarely made headlines. Western Canadian Select crude traditionally traded at a discount of roughly $14 to $18 per barrel compared with West Texas Intermediate. That discount existed because of geography, pipeline constraints, and one simple reality. For decades, Canada had essentially one dominant customer. And when a seller depends heavily on a single buyer, that buyer often gains considerable influence over pricing. While that arrangement ensured Canadian oil continued flowing south, it also saved American refiners billions of dollars through access to consistently discounted crude. But that balance began to change as Canada started building alternatives. Alberta proposed a new pipeline capable of transporting up to 1 million barrels of oil per day westward toward Pacific markets instead of exclusively south to the Gulf Coast. Combined with the expanded Trans Mountain pipeline, capable of moving between 900,000 and 1 million barrels per day, Canada was steadily creating the capacity to redirect as much as 1.9 million barrels of crude away from American refiners. And that has significant implications. Once the United States is no longer Canada's only major customer, its pricing advantage naturally begins to weaken. Access to additional buyers, particularly in Asian markets willing to pay closer to global prices, could narrow the discount American refiners had benefited from for decades. As that discount shrinks, input costs for refiners may increase, potentially affecting industries and consumers further down the supply chain. Those were the long-term strategic calculations, increasingly drawing attention in financial markets and policy circles alike. This was no longer just a dispute over wine, bourbon, or tariffs. It had become a much broader question about North America's future energy relationship and whether Canada was gradually reducing its dependence on a single market. Then came the moment that fundamentally changed the direction of the confrontation. Mark Carney accepted an invitation to speak at the Economic Club of New York, and what followed became one of the most closely watched speeches of the dispute. He didn't arrive angry. He didn't spend his time attacking the Trump administration or revisiting old grievances. There were no emotional accusations, no dramatic confrontations, and no attempt to score political points. Instead, he relied on something far more persuasive: numbers. Speaking with the calm precision of someone who had spent years as a central banker, Carney presented a vision of Canada's future built not on rhetoric, but on measurable economic realities. He described a country deliberately repositioning itself within the global economy. $1 trillion in targeted investment over 5 years, an investment tax rate that had become the lowest among G7 nations, roughly half the group's average and 4 percentage points below that of the United States. A plan to export 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually by the end of the decade, with the potential to double that capacity over the following 10 years. 56 critical mineral agreements signed with more than 10 countries, unlocking more than $18 billion in investment, and plans to expand electricity generation capacity by 160 gigawatts. Canada wasn't presenting itself as a country asking for special treatment. It was presenting itself as an increasingly attractive destination for global investment, an emerging energy powerhouse, and a long-term strategic partner for international capital. Investors were paying attention. Canada had begun recording the highest foreign direct investment per capita among G7 countries. Germany's state-owned energy company had already signed a long-term agreement to purchase 1 million tons of LNG annually from Canada's LNG projects under a contract extending up to 20 years. While Washington continued debating tariffs, Berlin was quietly securing Canadian energy supplies for decades to come. Then Carney delivered a sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. A strong Canada will help make America great again. At first, it sounded like a diplomatic compliment, perhaps even a clever reference to a familiar American political slogan. But beneath the surface, it carried a much deeper message. Canada wasn't presenting itself as a dependent nation seeking approval. It was presenting itself as an indispensable partner whose role in the North American economy could not simply be replaced. Carney reinforced that argument with more numbers. Canada purchases more American goods than China, Japan, and Germany combined. It supplies roughly 99% of America's imported natural gas, about 85% of its imported electricity, and nearly 60% of its imported crude oil. The message wasn't confrontational, it was economic. The relationship between the United States and Canada wasn't built on dependence flowing in one direction, it was built on mutual dependence. And while Canada continued expanding its relationships with partners around the world, it was also gradually reducing the risks that came from relying too heavily on a single market. That wasn't a threat. It wasn't political theater. It was a presentation built on data, long-term planning, and economic reality. In the weeks following Mark Carney's appearance in New York, the atmosphere in Washington gradually began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic reversal, and it wasn't announced through a press conference. Like many meaningful geopolitical adjustments, it unfolded quietly through subtle changes in language, priorities, and strategy. The sharpest rhetoric began to soften. Public threats of escalating tariffs became less frequent, while conversations that had once centered on pressure and ultimatums increasingly turned toward negotiation and shared economic interests. Republican lawmakers from agricultural and energy-producing states watched businesses in their districts absorb the effects of Canada's consumer boycott, while concerns grew over the long-term implications of losing access to consistently discounted Canadian energy. At the same time, American companies whose supply chains crossed the Canadian border multiple times during production also made their concerns known through industry groups and government channels. And regardless of anyone's broader opinion of Donald Trump, one thing has remained consistent throughout his political career: he has paid close attention to economic indicators that influence both markets and public perception. The numbers were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Wine exports had fallen sharply. Bourbon exports had dropped to their lowest levels in years. Kentucky distilleries were reducing production. Canada was expanding its energy relationships across Asia, while Germany was signing long-term agreements with Ottawa to secure Canadian energy supplies for decades. Whether inside government agencies, congressional offices, or policy circles, difficult questions were becoming harder to avoid. Could this strategy continue indefinitely? Was additional escalation likely to strengthen America's position? Or was it beginning to impose greater costs at home than policymakers had anticipated? Those questions reflected a broader strategic reality. There was no obvious path to escalation that guaranteed a better outcome, and no easy way to ignore the growing evidence that economic interdependence imposed costs on both sides. That became the real turning point. Quiet, gradual, and entirely consistent with how major geopolitical recalibrations often unfold. Washington didn't announce a dramatic retreat, nor did it issue public apologies. Instead, its approach gradually evolved. The conversation shifted away from confrontation and toward negotiation, away from ultimatums and toward shared interests, and away from the assumption that Canada depended entirely on the United States toward a growing recognition that the relationship had always been built on mutual dependence. When Mark Carney was later asked about the changing atmosphere, his response reflected the same calm approach he had maintained from the very beginning. This was never a situation where one country dictated terms while the other simply accepted them. As Carney put it, the United States does not write all the rules. That wasn't a declaration of victory. It was a reminder that in an interconnected global economy, influence is rarely exercised by one country alone. Now, I'd like to step back from the specific dispute between Canada and the United States, because this story is about far more than wine, oil, or tariffs. It's about a broader pattern that has been developing for years, one with potentially significant implications for the future of American influence in an increasingly interconnected world. Here's the pattern. Throughout this dispute, the Trump administration's approach to economic pressure followed a familiar strategy: identify a target, apply maximum political and economic pressure, assume the other side will eventually compromise because the United States possesses greater economic and geopolitical weight, and ultimately expect that leverage alone will produce the desired outcome. But history suggests that leverage has never been unlimited, and it has never been without cost. When economic pressure becomes a primary negotiating tool, several long-term consequences often begin unfolding at the same time. First, the targeted country gains a powerful incentive to reduce its dependence and build alternatives. Canada is hardly unique in this respect. Across Europe, Asia, and other regions, governments have increasingly recognized that relying too heavily on any single economic partner can become a strategic vulnerability. As a result, many have quietly diversified their energy supplies, expanded technology partnerships, strengthened financial cooperation, and invested in new trade corridors, not because cooperation with the United States has become impossible, but because reducing strategic risk has become an increasingly important national objective. Second, periods of economic tension often create opportunities for other global powers. China is perhaps the most obvious example, but it is far from the only one. The European Union, India, and several emerging middle powers also benefit when they are perceived as stable, predictable, and reliable long-term partners. They don't necessarily have to outperform the United States in every category. They simply need to offer consistency at a time when predictability becomes increasingly valuable. Third, repeated reliance on economic coercion can gradually affect one of America's most valuable strategic assets, its credibility. The global role of the U.S. dollar, the strength of American financial markets, and the willingness of countries to align with Washington have all been built over decades on confidence, trust, and predictability. When that predictability is repeatedly tested, especially during highly public disputes with long-standing allies, questions naturally begin emerging about long-term reliability. That doesn't mean America's influence suddenly disappears. Far from it. But credibility, like trust, is often easier to preserve than it is to rebuild. In the case of Canada, Washington eventually adopted a less confrontational tone, yet the broader lesson extends well beyond this particular dispute. Future governments facing similar pressure are likely to study Canada's experience carefully. They'll examine how disciplined negotiation, domestic political unity, and the gradual development of alternative economic relationships can reshape the balance of leverage over time. Future governments facing similar pressure are likely to study Canada's experience closely. They'll notice that 73% of Canadians supported maintaining their position. They'll see Germany committing to long-term Canadian energy agreements. And they'll begin asking an important question of their own. What sources of leverage might be underestimated in our own relationship with the world's largest economy? That's why the Canada episode shouldn't be viewed as an isolated dispute. It may instead represent an early example of how economic power is evolving in the 21st century. When broad economic pressure meets a country that is strategically patient, economically significant, and deeply connected to international partners, the outcome can be very different from what traditional power politics might predict. Looking ahead, the more important question isn't whether Washington should have applied more pressure or escalated the dispute more aggressively. It's whether policymakers draw the right lesson from what actually happened. In today's global economy, leverage rarely flows in only one direction. Supply chains run both ways. Trade relationships create mutual dependence. And the country facing pressure today may become tomorrow's critical supplier, investment destination, or strategic partner. When the consequences of political confrontation begin appearing in factories, refineries, farms, and communities at home, the image of strength presented in public can look very different from the economic realities being discussed behind closed doors. And that brings us back to where this story began. Donald Trump stood before the cameras and suggested that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. He also declared that America didn't need anything Canada had. But over the months that followed, the numbers told a far more complicated story. American wine exports to Canada fell by 78%. Hundreds of millions of dollars disappeared from a single export market. Bourbon exports dropped to their lowest levels in years. Production slowed at Kentucky distilleries. Canada accelerated its efforts to expand energy exports toward Asian markets while strengthening its position as an increasingly attractive destination for global investment. Germany committed to long-term Canadian energy agreements, and Mark Carney responded not with political theater, but with economic data. Gradually, Washington's tone began to evolve. That doesn't necessarily mean one side achieved a decisive victory while the other suffered a clear defeat. The reality was far more complex. As the dispute unfolded, the economic realities of mutual dependence became increasingly difficult for both sides to ignore. And once those realities moved to the center of the conversation, even the loudest political rhetoric had to make room for practical economic considerations. Some people may look at this outcome and describe it as Washington backing down, but I think there's a more accurate way to understand what happened. This wasn't a simple victory for one side or a defeat for the other. It was a strategic recalibration driven by economic reality. A policy built on certain assumptions eventually encountered the limits imposed by genuine economic interdependence. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of this entire story. It's not that America is weak, far from it. The lesson is that no nation, not even the world's most powerful economy, can assume its leverage is unlimited, its dependencies are invisible, or that its partners have no meaningful alternatives. Canada demonstrated that alternatives can be created, and once those alternatives became increasingly credible, the balance of the negotiation naturally began to change. I'm Daniel Chen, Senior Geopolitical Analyst. I focus on the structural shifts in global politics, economics, and international relations that often emerge quietly in the data long before they dominate the headlines. And this was one of those moments. If you found this analysis valuable, I hope it encourages you to look beyond the headlines and pay closer attention to the deeper forces shaping global events. The patterns we've explored today aren't limited to the relationship between Canada and the United States. Similar dynamics are already emerging across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions where trade, energy, technology, and geopolitics are becoming increasingly interconnected. The Canada dispute may not be the last example of this trend. It may simply be one of the clearest examples of how economic power is evolving in the 21st century. Because in geopolitics, the biggest stories are rarely defined by the loudest headlines. More often, they're written quietly, in supply chains, trade agreements, financial markets, and strategic decisions that reshape the world long before most people realize what's happening. Thank you for watching. I'm Daniel Chen, Stay curious, keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next analysis.